Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Please remember that sound, that faint static hum, the tracking lines that would dance across the screen, and the chilling thrill of a good old VHS horror movie. It was a different kind of scary, wasn't it? A bit fuzzy, a little warped, almost like you were watching a memory, or maybe even a ghost. What if I told you that one of the most famous ghost stories of all time, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, wasn't just a classic tale? What if I told you it was a chilling analog ghost story, hiding in plain sight during the 1980s, on a tape that was never meant to be found? Today we're not just telling a story, we're pressing play on a nightmare. We're about to rewind to an era where the Headless Horseman galloped straight out of your VCR, offering a uniquely unsettling take on a legend, one that was lost to the snows of time. Can a story truly change when it's filtered through the grainy lens of a VHS tape? We're about to find out, so get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare for part one of the whispering static of Sleepy Hollow. And as we go on this journey together, I'd love to know what you think. Drop a comment below with your own memories of VHS horror, or if you've ever come across a piece of lost media that gave you the chills. And of course, if you enjoy these deep dives into the dark and the forgotten, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. Also, let me know what kind of story you want me to read next. Your suggestions are what bring this channel to life. Host. Alright, are you ready? Let's begin. The world beyond Julian's window had vanished, erased by a relentless blizzard that had been raging for 3 days. His cabin, a small, sturdy structure of dark timber and river stone, felt less like a home and more like an ark, adrift on a vast, featureless ocean of white. He had chosen this place, nestled deep within the Catskill Mountains, for its profound isolation. As a freelance archivist and media preservationist, his work thrived in silence, in the focused, monastic quiet that only true remoteness could provide. His clients, scattered across the globe, were collectors of the obscure, hunters of lost celluloid and forgotten magnetic tape. They sent him decaying film reels and fungus-eaten cassettes, and he, with the patience of a secular monk, would coax their ghosts back into the digital light. But this winter, the silence was different. It was heavier, imbued with the weight of the snow that was now piled halfway up his windows, sealing him in. Whoa! The power had flickered out on the first day, a common occurrence he was well prepared for. The generator, a grumbling beast in the shed out back, now provided the low, steady heartbeat of his existence, powering his restoration equipment, a single lamp, and the small electric heater that fought a valiant but losing battle against the invasive cold. His days were measured not by the sun, which remained a pale, indistinct smear behind a ceiling of perpetual grey, but by the meticulous process of his work. He would clean, respool, and digitize his long, slender fingers, often stained with chemical residue, moving with a practiced, gentle precision. The evenings were for himself, for reading by the fire, for listening to the wind howl its mournful epics, and for exploring the more curious acquisitions from his own collection. Wow! It was on the third night of his entombment that he found the tape. It was part of a bulk lot he'd purchased from an estate sale in a sleepy Hudson Valley town months ago, described simply as assorted home movies and recordings. He'd worked his way through most of the box already, digitizing grainy birthday parties, awkward Christmas mornings, and blurry, sun-bleached vacations. They were mundane fragments of anonymous lives, little pixels of forgotten joy. But this one, at the very bottom of the box, was different. The case was a generic, sun-faded clamshell of brittle plastic, the kind that cracked if you looked at it too hard. There was no studio logo, no promotional art. The only identifier was a simple, handwritten label on the spine, penned in a neat but slightly shaky cursive. It read, Sleepy Hollow, the Winter Echo. Below it, in smaller, more hurried block letters, "Do not copy. For Tarrytown historical use only. 1 of 1. Julian's interest was immediately piqued. He was, of course, intimately familiar with Washington Irving's tale. He'd seen nearly every film adaptation, from the 1949 Disney animation to the gothic spectacle of Tim Burton's 1999 film. He even owned a rare 16mm print of the 1922 silent version. But this title, The Winter Echo, was completely unknown to him. The label's stern warning and its claim of singularity suggested something more than a simple off-air recording of a known broadcast. This felt like something different, something private. He took the tape from its case. It was a standard Bay SFT-20, its plastic body a familiar, reassuring weight in his hand. The label on the cassette itself was a replica of the one on the spine, though the ink here was more faded, the corners of the sticker beginning to peel. He ran a thumb over the cursive script, a strange, prickling sensation crawling up his arm, a faint but undeniable sense of static electricity. He dismissed it as a product of the dry, cold air in the cabin. His professional setup was in the main room, a formidable bank of monitors, vectorscopes, and restored VCRs that looked like an altar to a bygone technological god. He chose his sturdiest machine, a Panasonic AG 1980, a workhorse revered by archivists for its built-in time-base corrector and noise reduction capabilities. As he slid the cassette into the machine's hungry maw, the cabin felt unnaturally quiet. The generator's hum seemed to recede, and the wind outside held its breath. The only sound was the soft whir of the loading mechanism, and the solid, satisfying clunk as the tape seated itself against the video drum. He dimmed the lamp, leaving only the warm, flickering glow of the nearby fireplace to illuminate the room. He settled into his worn leather chair, the cold seeping through the floorboards making him pull his woolen blanket tighter around his shoulder. On the primary monitor, a professional-grade CRT he kept specifically for authenticating analog sources, a burst of harsh blue filled the screen. Julian pressed play. The screen dissolved into a blizzard of static, a roaring, monochrome chaos. This was not the gentle fuzz of a blank tape. This was aggressive, angry noise, accompanied by a low, guttural hiss that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. He instinctively reached for the tracking knob, his fingers dialing it back and forth with practiced ease. The lines of static began to organize themselves, to reluctantly coalesce. The roaring hiss softened, resolving into the sound of a howling wind, a wind that sounded uncannily like the one currently battering the walls of his cabin. Slowly an image bled through the noise. It was not a studio logo or a government warning. It was a shot of a snow-covered landscape, filmed from a high vantage point. The quality was poor, grainy, and washed out, characteristic of consumer-grade cameras from the early 1980s. The colors were muted, dominated by whites, grays, and the deep dark green of pine trees heavy with snow. In the distance, through the flurries of falling snow captured by the camera's lens, a small town was visible, its rooftops blanketed, smoke curling from its chimneys in faint, ghostly plumes. A simple typewritten title appeared, stark white against the grey sky, Sleepy Hollow, January 1982. Julian leaned closer to the screen. This was not a film set. The shaky, handheld quality of the shot, the way the wind buffeted the microphone, it felt like a documentary or a home movie. Below the main title, another line faded in, a record of the great blizzard and the phenomena that followed. Phenomena. The word hung in the air, charged with implication. The scene cut, not with the clean edit of a professional production, but with a jarring, instantaneous jump that made the VCR's heads protest with a slight squeal. The new shot was from within the town itself, looking down a deserted main street. The snow was piled in enormous drifts against the storefronts, their signs, Van Tassel's Mercantile, Brouwer's Butchery, painted in old-fashioned script. The architecture was authentically colonial, preserved and pristine beneath its thick mantle of white. There was no movement, no sign of life. The town was a perfect frozen tableau, captured under the cold, bright light of a winter sun, breaking through the clouds. The only sound was that same, omnipresent wind. A voice began to speak. It was a man's voice, older, with the gentle, slightly reedy tone of an academic or a local historian. There was no music, just the stark sound of his narration over the wind. "They say the valley has always been a place of enchantment," the narrator began, his voice laced with a faint crackling distortion from the aging tape. Washington Irving knew it. He felt the drowsy, dreamy influence that hangs in the very air. But what he wrote of was a slumberous, autumnal haze. He never knew the hollow in the grip of a true winter silence, a silence that listened. The camera panned slowly, shakily, down the street, lingering on the frost-etched windows of the old church, its steeple, a stark finger pointing at the grey sky. "The great blizzard of '82 was the worst in living memory," the voice continued. "For a week Sleepy Hollow was cut off from the world. No roads, no power, no telephone. We were cast back in time, living as our ancestors did. And in that isolation, in that profound quiet, the old stories began to stir. The valley's memory began to awake, and the horseman, who we had relegated to a quaint tale for tourists and schoolchildren, began to feel terrifyingly real once more." The image cut again, this time to a close-up of a photograph, held by an unsteady hand. It was an old sepia-toned daguerreotype of a stern-faced man in colonial attire. The camera slowly zoomed in, the low-resolution video struggling to capture the details. "This is the first piece of the puzzle," the narrator said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The official account of the Hessian trooper's death is well known. Decapitated by a cannonball during an unnamed skirmish of the Revolutionary War. His body buried in the old Dutch churchyard. But the Tarrytown Historical Society, in the days before the storm, had acquired the private diary of one of the church's former ministers, Reverend Frelinghuysen, dating to the 7th. Another jarring Now the camera was focused on an open book, its pages yellowed and brittle, covered in spidery faded brown ink. A finger, presumably the narrator's, pointed to a specific passage. Frelinghuysen wrote of a different story, the narrator whispered, the tape hiss seeming to intensify around his words. He claimed the Hessian was no mere soldier. He was a practitioner of dark European arts, a man who consorted with shadows. He wasn't killed by a cannonball in battle. He was executed, condemned for heresy and witchcraft by a secret tribunal of his own commanders, who feared his growing power, and his beheading. It was a ritual, a failed attempt to sever his spirit from the land he sought to dominate. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. This was a complete radical rewriting of the foundational myth. Not a soldier, but an occultist. Not a random casualty of war, but the subject of a ritual execution. The static on the tape seemed to coalesce for a moment, and for a split second, Julian thought he saw a shape in the noise, superimposed over the diary's page. A tall, gaunt figure, standing in a snowy wood. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, a phantom on the magnetic stream, a tracking error. It had to be. The camera pulled back from the diary to show the narrator's study. It was a room filled with books, maps and historical artifacts. An oil lamp cast a warm, dancing glow over the clutter, suggesting this was filmed during the power out. The narrator himself remained unseen, the camera his only proxy. "We dismissed it as folklore," the voice sighed, filled with a profound retrospective dread. "A colorful embellishment. We were planning a small exhibit, myths and truths of the horseman. We were fooled. We didn't understand that the blizzard wasn't just a weather event. It was an invitation. The silence it created, the purity of the unbroken snow, it was the perfect canvas, the perfect medium for the echo to finally take form." The screen cut to black. The hiss of the tape filled the cabin once more, loud and insistent. Julian sat frozen in his chair, the woolen blanket clutched in his fists. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was not a movie, it was a testament, a ghost story told by a man who seemed to believe every word,
recorded in the very heart of the event he was describing. The claim on the box, one of one, suddenly felt less like a statement of rarity and more like a warning. He glanced at the window. The snow was still falling, thick and hypnotic. The world outside was gone. There was only the white and the dark, and the cabin, and the whispering static that seemed to promise so much more than just a story. He felt a sudden overwhelming urge to stop the tape, to eject it and throw it into the fire, to let the mystery die, unspoken in the flames. But he was an archivist, and the archivist's curse is to always need to see what comes next. With a trembling hand he reached out, his fingers hovering over the VCR. The sound of the howling wind on the tape and the howling wind outside his window seemed to merge, becoming one terrifying, seamless chorus. He was sealed in just as the town had been, and he had the chilling premonition that the phenomena were about to begin again.
The decision was not born of courage, but of compulsion. The archivists need to know. The primal human urge to stare into the abyss overwhelmed the instinct for self-preservation that was screaming at him to stop. Julian's hand, which had been trembling, was now steady. He saw his task with a chilling clarity. This tape, this winter echo, was a piece of lost media, unlike any other. It was not merely a forgotten film. It was a testament, a warning, and he was now its sole audience. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and his finger depressed the play button with a firm, final click. The screen flickered, and the roaring hiss of the tape returned, but this time it felt different, less like random noise and more like a held breath, waiting to be released. The blackness gave way to a new scene, picking up where the last had left off. The unseen narrator's study, still lit by the warm, unsteady glow of an oil lamp, signifying the continuation of the 1982 blizzard's power outage. The camera was no longer focused on books or artifacts. It was pointed at a map spread across a large wooden desk, a detailed topographical map of Sleepy Hollow and its environs. An echo needs a medium to travel, and a surface to reflect from. The narrator's voice resumed, closer now, more conspiratorial. The audio quality seemed to have degraded further, with a persistent, low-frequency hum, now underpinning his words. The Hessian, in his arrogance, had tried to bind his spirit to the very land. The ancient stones, the old-growth trees, he saw them as anchors for his immortality. We had always treated the locations from Irving's story as quaint landmarks, the Wiley Swamp, Raven Rock, the Great Tulip Tree, but Frelinghuysen's diary painted them in a new light. They were not just locations, they were components of a ritual, a vast occult circle, with the old Dutch churchyard at its heart, a place of containment. On the map, a gloved finger traced a path in the snow-dusted light from the window. It circled landmarks, connecting them with confident, deliberate lines, forming a complex geometric pattern across the valley. Myths are the memories of a landscape, the narrator continued, a tremor of excitement in his voice. And I believe that the blizzard, this immense pressure of silence and cold, has created the perfect conditions for that memory to manifest, to become tangible. I had to know, I had to find proof. So, on the fourth day of the storm, with the snow finally letting up, I took a recording device, and went to the place where the echo is said to be the strongest, the place where they say he was actually captured, Raven Rock. The image cut with another jarring snap. The screen was filled with motion, a shaky first-person perspective of someone trudging through deep snow. It was daylight, the sun a brilliant, blinding white orb that made the endless expanse of snow sparkle with ferocious intensity. The sound was muffled, dominated by the crunching of snow underfoot, and the heavy rhythmic breathing of the person holding the camera. In the corner of the frame, a small black microcassette recorder could be seen in a gloved hand, its tiny red recording light a pinprick of color in the monochrome world. The following is from an audio recording made on January 14, 1982. The narrator's voice explained, now layered over the sound of the trek. The video camera's battery was too weak for the cold, but the audio recorder, it worked. The video image on the tape froze, becoming a still frame of the snowy woods, and the soundscape shifted. The heavy breathing and crunching snow of the video were replaced by a tinier, more distant version from the audio recording. The hiss was more pronounced, the wind a thin reedy whistle. For a full minute, the only sound was the lonely rhythmic crunch 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 of boots in powder. Julian found himself leaning forward, his ears straining, the silence of his own cabin making the recording feel impossibly present. Then, another sound began to emerge from the hiss. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind. A second set of footfalls, but they were wrong. They weren't rhythmic like the narrator's. They were heavier for one, with a dragging, stumbling quality. Thump, scrape, and they were unnervingly paced, seeming to fall in the silent moments just after the narrator's own steps, as if mimicking him or stalking him. "Is someone there?" the narrator's voice asked on the recording, suddenly sharp with alarm. The crunching of his own feet stopped. For a moment, there was only the hiss of the tape and the whistle of the wind. Then the other sound came again. Thump, scrape, closer now, much closer. "Hello," the narrator called out, his voice tight with fear. There was no reply, only a new sound, sharp and clear, that cut through the static like a razor. It was the sound of cold, heavy iron scraping against stone, a metallic shriek that made the hair on Julian's arms stand on end. It was followed by a sound that was wet and visceral, a sickening thwack, like a butcher's cleaver hitting a block of frozen meat. The narrator cried out, a short, terrified gasp, and the recording ended in a burst of screeching static. The VCR automatically switched back to the video feed. The image was once again the narrator's lamplit study. The camera was shaking violently. The narrator was breathing in ragged, panicked gasps. "It wasn't human," he stammered, his voice raw with terror. The cold, the sheer, unnatural cold that came with it. It was there, in the wood. "It's awake." As the narrator spoke of the cold, Julian felt it in his own cabin. The small electric heater in the corner, which had been glowing a steady orange, flickered, its fan sputtered, the comforting hum dropping in pitch before catching itself again. Julian's eyes darted towards it. The generator was still running, its rhythm unchanged, yet the heater was struggling. A coincidence, it had to be. He turned his attention back to the screen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The narrator seemed to be trying to compose himself, taking a long, shaky breath. The echo. "It's not just a memory," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its academic composure. "It's an imprint, a residual psychic energy, and it seems to be drawn to observation, to recording devices, as if the act of capturing it gives it focus, gives it form." He paused. "It followed me back. I don't think it ever left." At that precise moment, Julian heard it. It was a sound from outside the cabin, distinct from the wind and the generator. A low, heavy scrape thump against the northern wall of the cab, the wall that was buried under at least 6 feet of snowdrift. Julian shot out of his chair, his blood turning to ice. He slammed the pause button on the VCR. The image of the narrator's cluttered desk froze on the screen. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the low rumble of the generator and the frantic beating of his own heart. He stood motionless, listening, for a full minute. Nothing. Had he imagined it? Had the audio from the tape simply been too convincing, seeding his imagination? He had to be He grabbed a heavy maglite from the mantel, its metal body cold and solid in his grip, and moved towards the front door. The deep drift outside pressed against it, making it impossible to open more than a few inches. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort, and managed to force it open just enough to squeeze through. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The air was thin and sharp, and the sheer, overwhelming brightness of the sun on the snow was momentarily blinding. He shielded his eyes, looking at the northern wall of the cabin. The snow was perfect, pristine, a smooth, unbroken wave of white that crested against the dark timber of his home. There were no tracks, no marks, no disturbance whatsoever. Nothing could have made that sound without leaving a trace. It was impossible. He felt a wave of vertigo, his perception of reality tilting precariously. Was the isolation finally getting to him? Was he hallucinating? He backed into the cabin, pulling the heavy door shut, the thud echoing in the quiet. He was breathing heavily, his breath fogging in the cold air of the room. He leaned against the door, the cold of the wood seeping through his shirt. Impossible.
With a sense of grim determination, he walked back to his chair. His hand was shaking again as he pressed play. The face of the narrator was still unseen, the camera still his proxy. He had moved from his desk to a window. Outside, night had clearly fallen. The window reflected the interior of the study, the warm glow of the oil lamp, the towering shelves of... "It's been drawn to the weakest point," the narrator whispered, his voice trembling. "The place where the world outside and the world inside meet. Glass, the lens of a camera, a television screen." The camera pushed closer to the dark window pane, focusing on its own reflection. Julian could see the vague shape of the 80s-era video camera, the narrator's hands gripping it. Frayling Cousin wrote that the Hessian's ritual was meant to allow him to persist beyond death, his spirit bound to his chosen ground. But he warned that the spirit could be drawn out, that it could fixate on a living soul. It would see the world through their eyes, a passenger in their flesh, until it grew strong enough to hollow them out. The narrator fell silent. The only sound was the incessant hum on the tape. The camera remained fixed on the reflection in the dark glass. "It's in the room with me now," the narrator whispered, the words barely audible above the noise. "I can't see it, but when I look at the reflection, I can see." The camera tilted up slightly, and for a fraction of a second, Julian saw it. In the dark reflection on the window pane, standing in the room just behind the narrator's shoulder, was another shape. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, wrapped in shadow, its form indistinct and wavering like heat haze. It had no discernible features, no face, no head, just a towering silent presence in the dark. And at the exact instant the phantom appeared on the screen, the steady reassuring rumble of Julian's generator sputtered. The lamp on his desk flickered wildly. The CRT monitor squealed, the image on its screen rolling and collapsing into a single bright point of light. Then, with a final dying groan, the generator gave out. The cabin was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The monitor went dead. The heater fell silent. The world contracted to a single point of sensation. The oppressive total blackness. Even the fire in the hearth had died down to faint, pulsing embers, casting no meaningful light. He was alone, in the dark, in the silence. The only sound was the ceaseless, lonely howl of the wind outside. The exact same terrifying predicament as the man on the tape, and the narrator's final chilling words echoed in the sudden profound emptiness of the room. "It's in the room with me now." Julian didn't dare to breathe. He was a statue in his chair, listening to the silence, his eyes wide and useless, in the pitch black, searching the darkness for a tall, thin shape that he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, was listening back.
Silence. It was a physical entity in the absolute darkness, pressing in on Julian from all sides. The sudden death of the generator had stolen more than just light and heat. It had stolen the low, mechanical hum that had been the constant, reassuring pulse beneath his solitude. Now, there was nothing. No wind, no electronic whir. Only the frantic, wet sound of his own blood roaring in his ears. The blackness was complete, a velvet shroud that erased the familiar geography of his cabin, leaving him adrift in a void of pure, undiluted fear. He remained frozen in his chair, every muscle tensed, listening. He listened for the scrape of iron, the wet thump of a cleaver, the sound of a tall, thin shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the room. He listened for a breath that wasn't his own. The narrator's final words, a ghostly whisper from a dead tape, were branded into his mind. "It's in the room with me now." Minutes stretched into an eternity. His eyes, wide and straining, began to play tricks on him, painting faint, phosphorescent shapes in the dark. After images of the monitor, phantoms born of panic, but there was no sound, no movement, only the growing, biting cold. The fire had died, leaving behind only the faintest warmth, a memory of heat now being ruthlessly consumed by the cabin's encroaching chill. Survival instinct, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of his terror. He couldn't just sit here and freeze. He needed light. He needed to think. Slowly, Deliberately, he began to move. Every tiny shift of his weight on the old leather chair produced a groan that sounded like a cannon shot in the stillness. He reached out, his hands sweeping through the cold air, until they found the familiar, solid edge of the table beside him. His fingers spiders crawled across its surface, past the dead VCR, past the useless lamp, searching for the small box of emergency matches and the thick candle he always kept there. His fingers brushed against the box. Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over him. He fumbled it open, his numb fingers struggling to grasp one of the thin wooden sticks. The first match he struck snapped in his trembling hand. The second scraped uselessly against the striking strip. He took a deep, steadying breath, the cold air burning his throat, and struck the third. It flared to life with an aggressive whoosh. The sudden burst of light was painful, a white-hot star in his dark-adapted vision. In that initial brilliant flash, he instinctively scanned the room. The familiar shapes of his bookshelves, his equipment, the stone hearth, all were exactly where they should be. There was no tall, thin figure, no looming presence. There was only him, his own wild-eyed reflection, staring back from the blank screen of the CRT monitor. He brought the flame to the wick of the candle. It sputtered, caught, and then settled into a steady golden flame. The light, small and fragile as it was, felt like a fortress. It pushed the oppressive darkness back, creating a small, flickering sanctuary of light in the heart of the cabin. But in doing so, it created a legion of new shadows, long and distorted, that writhed and danced on the walls with every flicker of the flame. With the candle in hand, its warm wax already dripping onto his cold fingers, he stood and took a tentative step towards the VC. The ejected tape, the winter echo, sat beside the machine, a silent, black monolith. The story was cut off, the narrator's fate unknown, sealed in the sudden violent silence. Julian knew, with a sinking certainty, that the generator's failure was not mechanical, it was hostile. An action taken by the thing on the tape. The echo, as the narrator had called it, was not just an imprint, it was an entity, and it had seemingly severed his only connection to its story. But why? To trap him, to silence the narrator's testimony before it could be fully revealed. He was an archivist. When the primary source fails, you examine the secondary evidence, the packaging, the container. He picked up the brittle clamshell case, the candle flame casting dancing light on its faded plastic. The label, Sleepy Hollow, the winter echo, seemed to mock him. He ran his thumb over it again, that faint sensation of static electricity returning, even in the cold. He opened the case. The clips that held the tape were on one side. The other side was a flat, recessed area, usually reserved for promotional inserts or cover art. It was empty, or so he had thought. Now, in the focused, analytical light of the candle, he noticed something he'd missed in his earlier, more casual inspection. A faint line along the edge of the paperboard backing, hidden beneath the plastic sleeve. A perforation. His heart quickened. Using the tip of a small screwdriver from his toolkit, he carefully pried up the edge of the board. It wasn't just a backing, it was a sleeve, and tucked inside, folded into a tiny tight square, was a piece of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it. It was a single sheet of graph paper, brittle with age, covered in the same neat, slightly shaky cursive as the label. It was a hand-drawn map. It depicted the Sleepy Hollow Valley, but rendered with an unnerving, almost obsessive precision. The key landmarks from the tape were there. Raven Rock, the old Dutch churchyard, Wiley's Swamp. But they were connected by a web of ruler straight lines and strange, esoteric symbols that Julian didn't recognize. In the center of the complex geometric pattern, one location was circled several times in red ink, the churchyard, and in the margins, there were notes, frantic, desperate-looking annotations. The echo amplifies within the pattern, One read, "Observation is a catalyst. Recording is an invitation." Another, near the symbol for Raven Rock, said, "It left a piece of itself behind, iron and rage, buried in the stone, a focal point." But it was the note at the very bottom of the page that made Julian's breath catch in his throat. It was a simple, chilling question. Is the blizzard a prison, or a battery? He stared at the map, at the mad geometry laid out before him. This was the narrator's research, his descent into the myth. This was what he was trying to document before he was silenced. Julian's eyes traced the lines, the paths, the angle. He looked for familiar roads, for any modern landmarks that could help him orient the drawing. And then he saw it, a small, hand-drawn square on the northeastern edge of the pattern, just inside the outermost line. It was labeled with 2 words in tiny block letters that were almost an afterthought. Archivist's cabin. He dropped the map. It fluttered to the floor, landing by his feet. He wasn't just watching a story about a haunted town. He was in it. His cabin, his sanctuary of isolation, was built on the edge of the narrator's occult circle. His presence here, his act of watching the tape, had not been a random discovery. It felt like a trap that had been waiting for decades to be sprung. The cold was becoming unbearable. He had to get the power back. He had to see the rest of the tape. He had to know what happened to the narrator, if only to understand what was now happening to him. He bundled himself in his heaviest winter gear, coat, hat, gloves, boot. Grabbing the heavy maglite, even though it was useless, felt like a necessary ritual. He left the candle burning on the table, a tiny defiant star in the gloom, and stepped outside. The world had been reborn in silence and light. The sun was higher now, a brilliant disk in a sky of impossible crystalline blue. The sheer radiant beauty of it was breathtaking and terrifying. The snow wasn't just white, it was a canvas of blues and purples in the shadows, of dazzling diamond-like glints in the direct sun. The air was so cold and still that it felt solid, like breathing glass. Every sound was magnified, the crunch of his boots, the rustle of his coat. The path to the generator shed was a deep trench he'd shoveled earlier. Walking it now felt like moving through a canyon on an alien world. The silence pressed in, a palpable force. He found himself looking over his shoulder every few steps, searching the pristine, sun-drenched landscape for a tall, dark shape against the snow. He saw nothing. There was only the light, the snow, and the unnerving, listening silence. The shed was a small wooden structure, its roof laden with a thick blanket of snow. The door creaked open. Inside it was dark and frigid. He fumbled his way to the generator, the familiar shape, a comfort in the gloom. He ran his hands over its cold metal surface, checking the base. The fuel tank was still half full. The starter cord was in place. He braced himself and gave it a pull. The cord met with a grinding, unnatural resistance. He pulled again, harder, and was met with a sickening crack from within the machine's housing. It wasn't the sound of an engine trying to turn over. It was the sound of something breaking. He scrambled back outside, dragging the heavy generator out of the shed and into the brilliant sunlight to see what was wrong. What he saw made no sense. The fuel line, a thick rubber tube, was not just broken. It was encased in a 3-inch thick sheath of bizarre black ice. It wasn't frost. It was smooth, opaque, and radiated a deep, cellular cold that felt wrong, like the very absence of heat. Where the line entered the engine block, the metal casing around it was warped and shattered, as if it had been flash frozen and then crushed by an immense focused pressure. This wasn't a random failure. It wasn't an animal. This was sabotage, a deliberate physical act of malice that defied the laws of nature. The echo, the Hessian, it had been out here. It had touched his world, leaving behind its signature of unnatural cold and impossible force. A wave of pure panic washed over him. He was trapped. He was miles from any road, with no power, no heat, and something that could freeze and shatter steel was sharing his solitude. He stumbled back from the generator, falling into a snowdrift, his mind reeling. He lay there for a moment,
the sun warm on his face, the snow cold beneath him, his world completely upended. He wasn't an archivist anymore, he was a survivor. He was the next chapter in the story of the Winter Echo. He got to his feet, his jaw set. Fear was a luxury he could no longer afford. He trudged back to the cabin, his purpose now grimly clear. He couldn't watch the rest of the tape, but he had the map, he had the narrator's research, and he had the chilling realization that the narrator's investigation had ended in terror and silence. Julian's had just begun. Back inside the cold, candle-lit cabin, he looked towards the large picture window. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the temperature outside was plummeting. A delicate, crystalline layer of frost was beginning to creep across the vast pane of glass, spreading from the edges inward. He walked towards it, drawn by the intricate, beautiful patterns it was forming. He stood before the window, watching the ice paint itself across the glass, the last of the afternoon's golden light filtering through it. The patterns were complex, like ferns and feathers of ice. But as he watched, a strange, horrifying order began to emerge from the chaos. The random fractals began to connect, to flow into specific lines and curves, guided by an unseen, intelligent hand. Right before his eyes, in the center of the window, the spreading frost formed a perfect, unmistakable silhouette. It was a figure on horseback, tall and imposing, and where its head should have been, there was only the clear, cold glass, showing the snowy, sunlit landscape beyond. The Headless Horseman, rendered in ice, on his window, a message written in the language of the cold, and below it, the frost formed a new shape, a single, perfectly rendered word, soon.
The word soon hung on the glass, a crystalline promise of violation. For a long moment, Julian was paralyzed, his mind refusing to accept the reality of what he was seeing. It was a trick of the light, an illusion born of fear and isolation. But the silhouette of the horseman was too perfect, the letters of the word too precise. This was not random frost. This was a message delivered in the ink of winter itself. A sudden, violent shudder racked his body, breaking the paralysis. It was the cold, a deep, invasive chill that had finally bypassed his layers of clothing and sunk its teeth into his bones. The temperature in the cabin was plummeting with the setting sun, and the icy prophecy on his window was a stark reminder that the cold was not just a condition, it was a weapon, the entity's weapon. Panic gave way to a frantic, primal urgency. The frosted window was a declaration of intent, but the immediate threat was freezing to death. He turned his back on the icy spectre, his focus narrowing to the one thing that could fight the cold. The stone fireplace. It was his only hope for heat, his only source of non-supernatural light. His first action was to secure his fortress. He grabbed the edge of his heavy oak desk, the one that held his dead monitors and VCR, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, dragged it across the wooden floor. The screech of the desk's legs was a raw, ugly sound in the profound quiet. He wedged it firmly against the front door, a flimsy barricade that offered more psychological comfort than actual security. Next, the fire. He had a small stack of seasoned firewood on the hearth, enough for a night or two if he was careful. His hands, clumsy with cold and fear, arranged the kindling and logs. He struck a match, the flickering flame a tiny, precious life in the gloom, and touched it to the dry slivers of wood. It caught, and with a soft, hungry crackle, the fire began to breathe. He huddled before it, feeding it logs, mesmerized by the burgeoning flames. The light pushed back the encroaching darkness, and a wave of life-giving warmth began to spread through the room, thawing his frozen limbs, and for a moment, the icy knot of fear in his stomach. The fire was real. It was tangible. It was a shield. As warmth returned to his body, clarity began to return to his mind. He was an archivist, trapped inside a piece of unfolding history. He couldn't fast forward and he couldn't rewind. He could only observe and survive. He retrieved the hand-drawn map from the floor, its brittle paper crinkling in his hands, and spread it out before the hearth. The firelight made the red ink of the diagrams seem to pulse like blood vessels. The echo amplifies within the pattern. Observation is a catalyst. Recording is an invitation. He wasn't recording anymore, but he was observing. He was studying the narrator's work, focusing his thoughts on the very mystery the entity seemed to protect. Was his attention, his focus, acting like a beacon in the storm? Was he inadvertently feeding the thing he was trying to understand? Is the blizzard a prison, or a battery? He stared at the question. If the storm was a battery, then the silence and the cold were charging something. The entity wasn't just haunting the valley, it was drawing power from its isolation. And his cabin, positioned on the edge of the narrator's occult grid, was now the focal point of that power. A sound from outside broke his concentration. It was the sound of something heavy and sharp being dragged along the timber wall of the cabin. It moved slowly, deliberately, from the north wall around to the west. Julian froze, his eyes locked on the dancing shadows cast by the fire. He held his breath, listened. The scraping was punctuated by a low, heavy thump. Thump, thump, like a giant, misshapen footfall in the deep snow. It was the sound from the narrator's audio recording, the sound of the thing that had stalked him at Raven Rock. It was circling the cabin, testing the walls, measuring the perimeter of his tiny firelit world. The scraping stopped at the front of the cabin, near the barricaded door. Silence. Julian remained perfectly still, his hand gripping a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He strained his ears listening for the sound of splintering wood, for the desk being pushed aside. Nothing. The silence stretched, becoming more terrifying than the noise it replaced. Then a new sound began, a soft, insistent tap, tap, tapping. It was coming from his desk, from the bank of dead electronics. He rose slowly, the poker held tight in his white-knuckled grip. He crept towards the desk, his heart hammering. The tapping continued. He peered over the monitors. The sound was coming from the VCR. In the darkness, a single point of light was glowing on its front panel. The display, which should have been dark and lifeless, was illuminated with a faint, sickly green light. The light wasn't steady. It flickered, pulsed, and on it, numbers and symbols seemed to be fighting their way through a sea of digital static. He leaned closer, his breath fogging in the cold air. For a moment, the static resolved into a clear single image. A counter. It wasn't counting down time. It was a simple number display. 01. It held for a second, then dissolved back into flickering chaos. 1. One of what? 1 of 1. Like the label on the box. The first victim. The first observer. The machine was dead. The generator was a frozen, shattered wreck. This light, this number, was impossible. It was another message, another violation of the laws of his world. The echo was not just outside anymore. It was in the wires. It was in the machine. The scraping sound started again, louder this time, more aggressive. It wasn't on the walls anymore. It was on the large picture window. The sound of rough iron on glass. Julian spun around, his blood running cold. The firelight reflected off the window, illuminating the icy silhouette of the horse. The scraping was coming directly from the figure's center, as if the phantom itself were clawing at the glass, seeking entry. The place where the world outside and the world inside meet. Glass. The lens of a camera. A television screen. The narrator's warning. The window was the weakest point. He watched, mesmerized with horror, as a thin, black line appeared on the glass. It started at the edge of the icy silhouette and shot upwards with a sickening crack that echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. A spiderweb of tiny secondary cracks instantly radiated outwards, fracturing the frosty image of the horseman. The sound was horrifyingly intimate, as if a bone were breaking inside his own body. The entity was coming through the brittle barrier of glass. The separation between his world and its was failing. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The wind outside picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin,
making the new cracks in the window pane sing with a low, mournful hum. Julian stared at the fractured image. The entity on the tape wasn't just a ghost. It was a force of nature, a localized, malevolent winter that could shatter steel and now, glass. He thought of the narrator's ultimate fate, a story cut short by a burst of Julian's story felt like it was approaching a similar, abrupt ending. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. He couldn't leave the cabin. He couldn't fight the thing outside. The window was the point of entry. The narrator said the entity was drawn to observe the frosted image, the silhouette. It was a focal point, a lens. As long as the image was there, as long as he could see it and it could see him, it could focus its power. He had to break the line of sight. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything. A blanket, too slow. A piece of furniture, too cumbersome. His eyes fell upon the hearth. The fire roared, spitting embers. Beside it was a small metal bucket he used for carrying ashes, and next to it a container of soot and ash from the last time he'd cleaned An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. He couldn't fight the cold with heat, but maybe he could fight the image with its opposite. He couldn't break the window, but he could blind it. He could erase the picture. Another sharp crack ripped through the silence, and a new, larger crack raced across the pane. The outer layer of the double-paned glass was beginning to splinter and flake near the center of the web. Time was running out. He grabbed the ash bucket, his actions no longer driven by thought, but by pure, unreasoning instinct. He was no longer an archivist trying to understand a story. He was a character in the final frantic scene, trying to rewrite the end.